Imagine a date so powerful that it physically claims the lives of the men who built a nation. July 4th, the ultimate American symbol. You probably know the famous legend. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the birth of the United States, founding fathers John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both passed away on the exact same day. It feels like a myth, a poetic finale to the revolutionary generation. But what if I told you it happened again? 5 years later, a third US president died on the 4th of July. His name was James Monroe. He was the fifth president, the final member of the legendary Virginia Dynasty, and the very last founding father to ever lead the nation. But while history books paint his presidency as a peaceful era of good feelings, the truth is far more explosive. He was a rogue teenage soldier who nearly bled to death at the Battle of Trenton. He was a maverick diplomat who ignored his own president to buy a continent. And he was a leader who stood up to the world's greatest empires, drawing a line in the sand that still shapes global politics today. This is the wild, uncovered story of James Monroe. To understand the grit of James Monroe, we have to go back to the woods of Westmoreland County, Virginia in 1758. Born to a modest craftsman and patriot family, Monroe's life was upended by pure tragedy before it even really began. By the time he was just 16 years old, both of his parents had died. Suddenly, this teenager was the eldest son, completely responsible for his younger siblings and the family farm. He had to drop out of school just to survive. But a lifeline emerged. His wealthy, childless maternal uncle, Joseph Jones, stepped in as a surrogate father, paid off the family's debts, and enrolled Monroe into the prestigious College of William and Mary. It was June 1774. The colonies were a powder keg. British intolerable acts were crushing the local economy, and Williamsburg was the epicenter of the brewing rebellion. When the Royal British Governor secretly confiscated the local militia's gunpowder, the college students revolted. Monroe didn't just join the protests, he took action. On June 24, 1775, a 17-year-old Monroe and just 24 other militiamen boldly stormed the British governor's palace. They successfully captured hundreds of muskets and swords, arming the revolution right from the governor's own basement. Monroe officially dropped out of college and joined the 3rd Virginia Regiment. Because he could read and write, the fledgling Continental Army commissioned him as a lieutenant. Soon he was swept into the desperate, freezing retreat across the Delaware River. General George Washington was desperate. The revolution was dying. In a final high-stakes gamble on Christmas night, Washington launched a surprise attack on a Hessian mercenary encampment at Trenton. Monroe was right on the front lines. As the combat raged in the freezing streets, a musket ball ripped into Monroe's shoulder, severing a major artery. He collapsed into the snow, rapidly bleeding to death. He would have died right there if a local doctor hadn't rushed onto the battlefield to tie off the bleeding artery. Washington personally cited Monroe for his exceptional bravery, promoting the bleeding young hero to the rank of captain. Monroe recovered and went right back to the fight. During the brutal winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, he shared a cramped log hut with another young soldier who would also make history, future Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. He also struck up a close friendship with the legendary French volunteer, the Marquis de Lafayette, who inspired Monroe to see their struggle as a global fight against tyranny. By the end of his combat service, Monroe was a hardened, battle-tested colonel. After the war, Monroe decided to study law, but he didn't pick just any teacher. He became the direct protege of the governor of Virginia himself, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson didn't just teach him law, he introduced Monroe to James Madison. Together, these three men would form a political alliance that would dominate American politics for decades. But Monroe's rise in the US Senate brought him face to face with an ideological enemy, the Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Monroe fiercely opposed Hamilton's aggressive central banking system. Then, in 1792, Monroe stumbled into a congressional investigation regarding Hamilton's finances. What he accidentally uncovered became America's very first major political sex scandal. Monroe discovered secret payments made by Hamilton to a man named James Reynolds. It wasn't financial corruption, It was hush money to cover up Hamilton's illicit affair with Reynolds' wife. Hamilton was utterly humiliated and blamed Monroe for leaking the details. The tension grew so toxic that the two men almost fought a deadly duel, avoided only at the very last second by the mediation of Aaron Burr. Hamilton never forgave him. Hoping to diffuse political tensions, President George Washington appointed Monroe as the U.S. Minister to France during the height of the bloody French Revolution. Monroe, a passionate supporter of republicanism, gave a speech so fiery and pro-French to the National Convention that he received a massive standing ovation. But back home, George Washington was furious, viewing the emotional display as a total violation of American neutrality. Despite the drama, Monroe used his leverage to pull off remarkable diplomatic rescues. He successfully freed imprisoned American citizens, saved the famous writer Thomas Paine from the French guillotine, and single-handedly secured the release of Lafayette's imprisoned wife. Washington eventually recalled him for being too disruptive, but Monroe wasn't done with France. Years later, President Thomas Jefferson sent him back as a special envoy. There, Monroe helped negotiate the legendary Louisiana Purchase, instantly doubling the size of the United States for a mere $15 million. After serving simultaneously as Secretary of State and Secretary of War during the brutal War of 1812, Monroe's leadership made him the obvious choice for the presidency. In 1816, he won a landslide victory. His presidency was so widely popular that the opposing Federalist Party completely collapsed out of national politics. When Monroe ran for re-election in 1820, he ran completely unopposed. He remains the only president in American history, besides George Washington, to ever achieve this. But the era of good feelings was an illusion. Beneath the surface, the nation was fracturing over its deepest sin: slavery. When Missouri applied to become a state, it triggered a bitter congressional battle that threatened to fracture the Union. Monroe signed the historic Missouri Compromise, admitting Missouri as a slave state, but drawing a strict geographic line across the continent banning slavery anywhere north of the 36-30° parallel. It paused a civil war, but the fuse was lit. Monroe's defining moment came in 1823. As European empires eyed the newly independent nations of Latin America, Monroe issued a bold ultimatum to the entire world: the Monroe Doctrine. He declared that the Western Hemisphere was officially closed to European colonization. Any intervention by a European power would be viewed as a direct act of aggression against the United States. It was a massive geopolitical flex for a young nation, and it remains a cornerstone of American foreign policy to this day. Yet, despite building an empire, Monroe's personal story ended in heartbreak. He spent his retirement plagued by severe financial insolvency, completely broke because of private loans he had taken out to fund his diplomatic missions abroad. He was forced to sell his beloved plantations just to pay his debts. On July 4, 1831, James Monroe took his final breath from heart failure and tuberculosis. He was the third president to die on Independence Day, taking the secrets of the revolutionary generation with him to the grave. He was the last president to wear the traditional tricorn hat, the powdered wig, and the knee breeches of the old world. A badass soldier, a fierce rival, and the leader who drew the lines of modern global power. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's hidden history, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Do you think the July 4th coincidence was destiny or pure luck? See you next time.